It's Thursday night, and if you're listening to this on Monday the 27th or the week of Monday the 27th, then you know that I'm recording this podcast on Thanksgiving. As I was driving home from my parents' house, I saw a line of people lined up at our local Target, and that got me thinking about retail, and that started making me think about Amazon because I don't step foot in stores anymore. So that made me think about all of the drivers and all of the crazy stuff that those people are doing over the next few weeks. And then that made me think about an article that I recently read in Wired magazine about Amazon's temporary workforce. They call it their camper workforce, and I'll explain what that means. I have dedicated a lot of time on this podcast to Amazon lately, and I'm dedicating even more time today. So this week, we are talking about the plight of the Amazon worker. I'm Joey Lombardi, and this is SourceCast episode 97. So what is Amazon's camper force? According to the Wired magazine article written by Jessica Bruder, in the mid-2000s, Amazon struggled to get employees to fulfill the demand of online purchases. Someone in some recruiting office somewhere figured out that they could get a migrant temporary workforce primarily made up of elderly people who live or travel in RVs. A lot of these people were impacted by the 2008 Great Recession and economic meltdown. A lot of people lost their homes. So these were older people who struggled to find work that Amazon embraced as temporary labor. The Wired article goes on to detail the work experience that these elderly people face. It's not uncommon for people who fulfill the picker role, which is actually grabbing stuff from shelves. It's not uncommon for those people to walk 15 miles a day in the warehouse. Many of the workers suffer from repetitive task injuries because they're using things like electronic scanners and there might be triggers on it. Many of the people who worked at the warehouses for several years say in the article that initially the work was laborious and sometimes tedious, but they appreciated the income, they appreciated the opportunity to get a job. But as the demand for labor increases, and I should say low-cost labor, Amazon has recently struggled to fill these positions. During the fall of 2017, Amazon is expected to hire 120,000 employees. That's the same number as last year, but it was a 20% increase from the year before that in 2015. These temporary laborers make an average of $11 or $12 per hour, and we've discussed Amazon's preference for older workers because they view them as more reliable. This podcast is not a criticism of Amazon. They're doing what they feel they have to do to run an effective business. Part of the Wired article covers the fact that Amazon is trying to automate these warehouses with robotic labor. There was a lot of comments in the Wired article from the temporary labor workforce at Amazon about the robotic workers, not because they were potentially replacing their jobs, but because of how inefficient the robot workers are. They easily got confused, they bumped into things, they would keep going back to workers with erroneous tasks. I have no doubt that Amazon will figure this out eventually, and this great need for this migrant nomadic workforce will be reduced. And I'm not sure how I feel about that because 100,000 jobs during the holiday season, at this point, I think it's still a good thing to have those jobs, especially if people need them. Even as I say that, there's a CNN.com article from October that states that Amazon is having a hard time filling those 120,000 jobs this year. And that's due to the fact that the unemployment rate is currently at 4.2%, which apparently is the lowest rate since 2001. The Department of Labor stated last month there are 6.1 million unfilled jobs opening across the country. I don't think that anyone is refuting the Amazon warehouses in the fall must be pure chaos. And that has to be a stressful work environment, especially for elderly people who might have been coming out of retirement to fulfill these jobs. Another interesting side note about Amazon's temporary labor, the company partnered with a staffing firm named Integrity Staffing Solutions. They're a Delaware-based company, and they have temporary offices throughout the country, especially where there are Amazon hot zones and warehouses. I want to point out the logic of Amazon using this intermediary staffing firm to bring in this temporary labor. This comes from a Huffington Post article from back in 2015, and I quote, "For employers, the appeal of this system is obvious. It allows companies to meet demand while keeping their permanent workforce at a minimum, along with all the costs that go with it, payroll, taxes, benefits, workers' comp, and certain legal liabilities. A few years ago, Amazon warehouse workers around the country claimed that they were victims of wage theft, and the defendant in the Supreme Court case was not Amazon, it was Integrity. The Huffington Post article goes on to say, employees feel like they're showing up to work every day with the knowledge that they are disposable. You're already one step away from the entity that you work for because there's an intermediary. And because Amazon is such a metrics-driven company, you're only as good as your last recorded input in a computerized performance monitoring system. If there's something that goes wrong in your life, like you're injured or you have a family crisis, there are a few protections. And actually, the main subject of that Huffington Post article from 2015 was that a temporary worker passed away in an Amazon warehouse. And it seems like there was no wrongdoing on Amazon's part. The story really just painted the sad circumstances around this gentleman's life. As the need for more workers rises with Amazon, and they're not able to fill all of those jobs, I noticed a Reddit thread that I wanted to share with you that details a first-hand account from someone who works for Amazon's delivery services and explains why you may see someone throwing boxes at your door. I'm going to have to really edit this. This guy curses a lot. The delivery guy had apparently worked for Amazon a few years earlier, and at that point, he said that he was well-trained and there was good communication between him and his bosses. This most recent stint, he claims that the training was non-existent, that someone who had gotten in the doors a few weeks earlier than him was now his trainer and supervisor, and he was essentially encouraging throwing the boxes on people's doorsteps and getting back in the car because, quote-unquote, they had 200 more packages to deliver. And that was also a common complaint in the Wired article that these most recent stints, the people were not getting the proper training, and that there were really high expectations from people who should have been given 3 or 4 weeks of training, and that training was compressed into 45 minutes. But yet they were held to the same standards and the same metrics as people who were properly trained. I don't want to minimize the experiences of the people who work at the warehouses, but I can see that there's a tendency to separate the corporate culture or the office culture with temporary workforce during the holiday season when you're the biggest retailer in the country. So then I started looking for articles that described Amazon's corporate culture. I found an article from Fortune.com back in June when Amazon made the Whole Foods acquisition, and the gist of the article was these are two corporate entities where cultures will clash. Based on the article, Whole Foods has a more creative and open culture. Amazon, and I quote, "For all of its undeniable success under founder Jeff Bezos, the company has gained a reputation for being a very tough place to work. Among the company's white-collar employees, it's widely regarded as relentless, hyper-competitive, and unforgiving, and for some, a wonderfully stimulating hothouse environment that spurs innovation. But for others, a terribly punishing place that leaves them feeling burned out and bruised." That Fortune article had a link to a 2015 New York Times piece on Amazon and Jeff Bezos. Once I read it, I remember that I read that article before, and it created quite a stir when it was released a few years ago. Based on this article by Jody Cantor and David Streitfeld, Amazon encourages their workers to tear each other apart, to tear their ideas apart, and encourage people to toil long and late into the evenings, responding to emails and text messages. Apparently, there's a system within the internal phone directory that instructs colleagues on how to send secret feedback to one another's bosses. The employees say it's frequently used to sabotage careers. The article goes on to say that people who are successful in the company dream up innovations that they can roll out to 250 million customers and accrue a small fortune in the process. People who are not successful in the company are fired in annual cullings of the staff. They call it purposeful Darwinism. I'm going to share a couple of examples about their workplace culture that was provided in the article. A book marketing manager named Bo Olson stated that he would often see people weeping in the office. And I quote, "You walk out of a conference room and you see a grown man covering his face. Nearly every person I work with, I saw cry at their desk." Leadership in the company is rewarded via stock bonuses, but the company as a whole has a very frugal mentality. They have bare-bone desks. Employees are expected to pay travel and cell phone expenses out of pocket. It's not like Google where there's food and snacks. Amazon's goal is to make the customer happy. They have a customer obsession. One marketing manager who worked in Amazon for 9 years, her name was Noelle Barnes. This is a great line. She said that Amazon is where overachievers go to feel bad about themselves. This is a horrible example that I think reached national headlines when the article came out. A woman who had breast cancer was told she was put on a performance improvement plan, which is Amazon code for "you're in danger of being fired," because difficulties in her personal life had interfered with fulfilling her work goals. Many former workers claimed they had similar experiences. The article goes on to quote a hiring consultant named Dick Finnegan whose primary focus is on how to retain employees. He warns that these mandatory cuts that Amazon performs could be a problem in the future. And I quote, "If you can build an organization with zero deadwood, why wouldn't you do it? But how sustainable is it? You'd have to have a never-ending 2-mile line around the block of very qualified people who want to work for you." Now that line hits home. Obviously, I've dedicated several podcasts to the possibility of Amazon creating a second headquarters in Philadelphia. In the last podcast where I mentioned this topic, at the time, I was warning about the potential impact to the city, increased cost, increased traffic, and I did mention that the company had a reputation for being hard to work for. Company representatives themselves stated in the article, Amazon's a place where you either love to work or you hate it. There's no middle ground. The other side is you can always dismiss some of this feedback as sour grapes or people who obviously were not a good match for the company. A 2013 survey by PayScale, which is a salary analysis firm, put the median employee tenure at Amazon at 1 year, which is among the briefest in the Fortune 500. Amazon officials insisted tenure was low because hiring was so robust, adding that only 15% of employees had been at the company more than 5 years. Amazon is stating that the turnover is consistent with others in the technology industry, but they declined to disclose any data. As I record this, I wonder why I dedicated yet another episode of the podcast to Amazon. But as I think about the boxes that greet me every time I open my door with that Amazon smile on the side, you really have to think about the energy that goes into creating such an operation. You have to have a culture that is maniacally dedicated to metrics and efficiencies, because if they have money leaking out of any core operation, they're not going to succeed. As Amazon diversifies and starts to minimize the risk of running in retail, there's definitely a little bit more headroom to take chances and to buy companies like Whole Foods. But at the core, there's a culture of efficiency and metrics and razor-thin margins that will always be a part of that company's DNA. There's a lot of talk right now that Philadelphia most likely won't be the candidate for the second headquarters for Amazon. It sounds like Dallas is the front runner. I don't want people to think that this episode is a hatchet job. I respect Amazon. I use their services every day, from delivery to music to their artificial intelligence. But those services come at a cost. They're clearly burning people out. And the New York Times article points at Amazon and says, this is so irregular. Most companies don't do that. But I don't think that's the case. I think since 2008, some aspect of that mentality of squeezing more, getting more with less, has propagated into any company that's trying to survive or thrive in the current economy. And just like their delivery services, maybe Amazon just does it better than everybody else. So now that Thanksgiving's over and we survived Black Friday, and you start ramping up those orders to make sure there are presents under the Christmas tree, be aware of what it takes to get those boxes to your front door. And when you see some dude tossing a box from 50 meters away onto your front door and you hear that glass shattering, instead of screaming, maybe you give them a knowing look because they have 200 more orders to fulfill. Or maybe not.
And that's all we have for this week. You can find SourceCast on iTunes, Google Music, and all of your favorite podcasting applications. SourceCast is recorded in bucolic, Mantua, New Jersey, and it's produced by my dad. The outro is performed by me, Ben Lombardi, and music is provided by Patrick Lee. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week.